The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is God, Mammon, and Exchange.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Created in the Image of God. If my prophetic vision is correct, it is now February 24th. I'm in the studio pre-recording today's show, episode 224, and the title is God, Mammon, and Exchange. So the guest is Devin Singh. And he is an associate professor of religion at Dartmouth College and a leading scholar at the intersection of theology, economics, and social ethics. He's the author of a number of books: Divine Currency, The Theological Power of Money in the West, and Economy in the Modern Christian Thought. He brings deep insight into this topic, one that I have a special affinity for, or a deep interest in, given my lifelong awareness of and participation in, to some degree, the Mosaic economic system, which is comprehensive and complex. We'll dive into all this and more in today's conversation. Welcome to the studio, Devin. And did I pronounce your last name right?
You did. Yeah. It's great to be here. Thank you, Wade.
And for those who want to Google him while we're on this and find out more about him, it's Singh and Devin. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
Awesome. So let's just dive right into the opening segment, which is your creation story, your backstory, the context of who and what you are, so that we can more fully understand what your views are when we get into them in the next segment. So who were your parents? Where were you born? And what was it like growing up, Devin?
Yeah, I appreciate you starting with that, because it does feel like it had a profound influence on the direction that my life took. So my dad came from India. He's of Indian, South Asian origin. My mother is a mix of Western and Northern European, kind of an Anglo-American mix. And they met in India and got married there. My mom was doing some research over there when she was in grad school. And my dad was kind of like a local guide, somebody on site there that she had contact with. And they connected there, fell in love, got married in his home village in Punjab in northern India. He comes from a Sikh religious background, but at that time and throughout most of his life was not particularly practicing. And they came back to the U.S., and I was born in California. And most of my
where in California was that?
Yeah, I was born in Sacramento, and
right.
So kind of lived in Sacramento as well as Berkeley, so sort of the East Bay, for the first few years of my life. But my mom joined the Foreign Service, and she worked for USAID, rest in peace. And she became a lifelong Foreign Service officer. And so when we were 3, we moved to Cameroon in West Africa.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you speak French as well? We were dabbling in German here a few minutes ago.
Yeah. So French was basically like a second mother language to me. I mean, I learned it.
Bien.
Oui, nous pouvons parler en français, si vous voulez.
Oui, je parle français, mais je parle meilleur allemande.
Oui.
Alors, anglais it will be the best here.
D'accord.
For everybody else.
Yeah, for sure. Of course. Yeah, we don't want to exclude anybody.
But no, I mean, I want to stop. I want to pause there for a moment, because years ago, I learned that music and foreign languages are 2 ways to actually increase your IQ. And I've thought about this, and one of the things is that if you really know a foreign language well, like yourself living in Cameroon, it's like a new operating system overlay. And you actually have the power to perceive things differently because the words that you use to process information have different meanings, have nuances. So you have to amp up your processing power as you navigate your way through life with these overlapping but diverse concepts in your head. Very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I like that. Yeah. I mean, it's something that, it causes you to have to create new synapses when your brain gets rewired in various ways because you're making these linguistic and conceptual connections that are new, constantly new. Yeah, so I was very grateful for that early exposure, both in terms of language and, of course, the cross-cultural element, which we can talk about and unpack as well. I lived in Cameroon, in Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, for 4 years, and then we moved to Morocco, and I was there for 3 years. So basically, from age 3 to 10, so 7 years of my childhood were spent in West and North Africa. There's a lot that I can talk about from those experiences. One big highlight that I have sometimes talked about is we lived through an attempted or a coup d'etat in Cameroon, where the army basically overthrew the president at the time, and our house was on a major thoroughfare where there was machine gun firefighting outside our house. Our house eventually was partly blown up because of a mortar that was launched into our backyard to flush out some of the rebels. Quite a pivotal experience for me. In addition to, there's so much more I can talk about in terms of the cross-cultural and the interreligious aspects of that time there. I am sort of intercultural and interreligious in my own body, in the sense that I have this multi-ethnic heritage. My dad coming from this Indian Sikh religious background, my mom coming from an Anglo loosely mainline Protestant background. Her family was loosely Episcopalian. We went to church a little bit when I was a child. And it wasn't really until junior high and high school for me, when we had moved back to the US and we were living in Maryland and the DC area, that my mom had a born again experience where she had this powerful kind of conversion experience and began attending more evangelically oriented and non-denominational churches. And that was quite a change in our lives and caught me off guard. And I found
how old were you at the time?
This is like 7th, 8th grade, so 13, 14, roughly. And I was going through kind of a rebellious punk teenage years. I was, getting in a little bit of trouble. Nothing too.
What were your favorite bands at that time?
So things like Red Hot Chili Peppers, but also I was really into the DC hardcore punk scene. So bands like Fugazi or Bad Brains or Minor Threat, which are, I don't know how many folks will know those, but.
Well, I'm familiar with them. Music, has been really important. And anyway, thank you. Gives context. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. But it also sort of fits into my narrative in terms of kind of how I developed, because I was gravitating toward some of these forms of music as well as social expression that were interested in kind of challenging the hypocrisy of abuse of authority, calling out the hypocrisy of figures that are in power. There's a lot about the punk movement that is really a cool social critique. It's a critique of problematic social systems and social injustice. And there was something about what I was discovering in the figure of Jesus that I found to be kind of punk rock. So, I kind of sort of describe my own exposure to Christianity as a very solitary experience. My mom had this conversion experience and told me to read the Bible, and I, was like, all right, fine, I guess I'll explore this. But I was, captivated by the character of Jesus in the Gospels and his way of doing these things that were very punk, calling out hypocrisy, challenging corrupt authority, calling for the
Creating a whip
protection.
and chasing out the money changers.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. Driving out the money changers and calling out that financial corruption, calling for the protection of the marginalized and the vulnerable and the weak. Right. There was a lot there that I thought was really cool, frankly. And I had a few interesting sort of experiences of being dragged to church by my mom and being put into like these youth groups and Sunday schools, and finding that a very shocking experience culturally, as well as contrast from what I was reading in the Bible, and then seeing what was could have acted out or lived in these experiences, and it didn't really line up.
Let me pause there as well and just dive down into one thing. So at that time or subsequently, were you aware of the degree to which what Jesus was doing was actually peeling back corruption on their own teachings and their own laws? I mean, he was revolutionary, and in that sense, we think progressive and forward-looking. But at the same time, he was also pointing out things that had been there all along that they had overlooked or shoved into the background or ignored, which gets us back to this whole Mosaic economic system and its intent and its purpose and its construction in the first place.
Sure. Yeah. And I, obviously as a teen, I don't know if I was fully clued into all of that nuance, but I, was able to read in the text these statements about, the getting back to the core of certain teachings, or revisiting what was actually written in the Torah, for example. And there was clearly some kind of conflict that was being staged there between Jesus and various religious factions, religious leaders of the day. And we can certainly talk about that at some point. I mean, there's a lot of scholarly debate about the actual accuracy of those encounters. A lot of that is rhetorically constructed to over stress a contrast between what Jesus was developing and what Jews are practicing. So I think there's a lot of important debate about whether the Pharisees were actually as problematic and corrupt as they are portrayed in the Gospels. But nevertheless, certainly for the Christian identity that was emerging and it's been established, there was this desire to set itself up against what the sort of practicing reigning Judaism of the day. Yeah.
Awesome. So you're going through this transformation as you're coming of age. Your own internal views are forming and shaping based on what you've seen in your experiences. Your mother has now dragged you into yet another cultural shift after your family moved, all over the world. So how did you emerge from all that and then chart your course as an adult?
So I went to California for college, and it was my sort of fantasy to move to California and put down roots and never move again, because I was also angry and rebellious about being dragged around the world every 3 to 4 years. As I've grown and matured, I'm grateful for that experience. But certainly at the time, there was a little bit of resentment, because it was hard to make friends all over again and all of that. Adapt to new cultures, etc.
No trial for the present, right? Seems whatever, but it yields fruit, right? Our experiences are so different yet so similar. What you just described was exactly my situation, right down to the fantasy. Because when I returned from Germany on a visit, and I was temporary there, I was actually on temporary disability, and then went back to Germany. While I was there was this discussion about, hey, you're living the dream. Forget about the fantasy. The fantasy being coming back to California and putting down roots in California, versus where my life was. Yeah. So, in other words, the parallels to the path here are almost eerie to me as I listen to you tell your story. It's wonderful to see somebody else have the same reaction to those opportunities, which at the time were very, very challenging and difficult.
Yeah, totally. So I was in California for just 4 years, basically, for my college experience before moving and living elsewhere, and I'll get to that. But my college was a formative time for me. I mean, I was deeply involved in a Christian fellowship that was kind of a campus ministry. I ended up majoring in religious studies as my major. I went in as a pre-med bio major, kind of by default. I loved biology in college. I was going to go to med school and do sports medicine and open up a kung fu studio. I didn't talk about the fact that I had practicing martial arts throughout high school, and it was a really formative part of my upbringing as well. I got my black belt in kung fu before I left to go to college, and yeah, I was gonna do sports medicine and have a studio to train. Anyway, life took a different course, and I ended up majoring in religion because I was really captivated by these questions of, the big questions of life, as I put it. Why are we here? What is this about? Working through my own interpretation of Christianity and trying to make sense of that, taking that increasingly seriously, and did a lot of things that folks in campus ministries often do, like went to Bible studies, eventually was a Bible study leader, was the sort of worship and praise leader, playing guitar and leading folks in praise choruses and things like that.
Were they punk-inflected praise choruses?
Were they what, sorry?
Punk-inflected praise choruses?
I mean, I was playing acoustic guitar at this point, but I was strumming pretty intensely, so there were some times when there was some edge, a little bit of edge to it. There's a lot that I can say about my experience in that campus fellowship, and good and bad. One of the good things was it was a fellowship that was really attuned to the socioeconomic teachings of Scripture, Christian Scripture, and the Hebrew Bible, and really trying to enact some of those things. And so I had a lot of, I think, formative experiences doing, what was called urban ministry or inner city ministry, being in places where there was extreme poverty, extreme need, extreme economic issues, whether in sort of short-term or kind of over summer projects. And it also spurred me to get involved in nonprofit work while I was in college. And so I had multiple part-time jobs working in different nonprofit agencies. That's all to say that there was a kind of practical side to what I was also diving into in classes, which was really gravitating toward religious teachings and reflection on questions of wealth and poverty, social revolution and transformation, whatnot. So classes on Latin American liberation theology were particularly interesting and captivating for me. But also, movements like Black theology in the U.S. and questions of racial inequity and the call for racial justice. And I, really from the get-go, I think, gravitated toward these questions of money, wealth, economy. And again, part of that, no doubt, was because of my upbringing living in these, third world countries, as they were called at the time, right? Developing nations, and would accompany my mom on site visits to various villages and projects that the USAID was funding. So I was exposed to all these questions of geopolitics, wealth and poverty, et cetera, at a young age. And so it definitely planted a seed, I think. I mean, that's at least how I make sense of part of why I'm interested in these things.
Yeah, that may be a good place to pause now, and we're going to go to a quick commercial break, which will be a video about Devin Singh's work, life, if I'm not mistaken. Again, we're pre-recording. When we come back, we're going to dive into the meat of what you just unpacked and where you're at. And there are a lot of open questions. This is really rich, fertile soil, and there is such an interest in America and the world today on these questions, and such polarization, frankly, on what the solutions are and how we should move forward. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that when we come right back after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere.
How do we take politics out of economics? Our economic problems have become a tool for political manipulation, but is there a way to break free from the old paradigms? Introducing More Than Laissez-Faire, a revolutionary textbook that challenges today's financial principles. Economics is more than just data. It's a science of human action, a philosophy that respects the human spirit. Bruce's groundbreaking model uses the methodology of subjectivism, starting simply and growing into a complex dynamic framework that integrates all economic theory, providing real solutions to today's economic challenges. Discover the alternative that the world has been waiting for. More than laissez-faire. A macroeconomic textbook, Alternative by Bruce Kerber. Available now at Amazon.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God with Devin Singh, S-I-N-G-H, D-S here on the screen, but look him up. Very involved and studied guest to have talking about these particular issues which we're about to dive into. So right before the break, we were bringing us all up to speed on how you got there to focus on these issues of faith, religion, scripture, economics, ethics, based on having traveled around the world, seen a lot of things, and understood Jesus to have been at the heart and core of this, as well as he drove money changers out of the temple, castigated the religious system of his day for not fulfilling those judgment, mercy, and faith issues, for not practicing pure and undefiled religion, right? Visit the widows and orphans in their affliction and keep themselves unspotted from the world. So just dive into and unpack how you then got into writing books and getting more involved into this space.
So after college, I went to divinity school thinking, I had sort of three options in mind. I was going to potentially go into some form of ministry. I was going to work in the nonprofit world and do community development, or I was going to do this take an academic track and academic route. And I had some mentors and professors in undergrad who were really bringing to my attention my own, as they put it, my own gifts and talents in this area of writing and reflection that, I'm grateful to them for that, because it wasn't something that I was fully self-aware of in terms of my abilities there. So that planted a seed. And over the course of my time, I moved to Chicago for divinity school. And over the course of my many years there, both in school as well as, working and doing other experiences in the city, it became clearer to me that this track of research, writing, and teaching was what I felt most passionate about. And so that sort of set the stage for me to do further graduate work and eventually, a PhD. But I always knew it was going to be in this area of religion and its connection to economics and money. So part of it was for these reasons that I mentioned initially, of a sense of passion about and a burden for bringing some of this ethical reflection to the world of money and markets, and to try to create a more just and equitable world. And some of it became intellectual fascination as well. I mean, when I took a deep dive into trying to make sense of money, it is wild. It's wild. And we've had money in some form or another for, 3,000, 4,000 years, depending on how you do the history. And we still can't agree on what it is and where it comes from and why it works.
So real quick, what is the specific PhD that you did, and perhaps your thesis?
Sure. Yeah. So I went to Yale and did my PhD in the religious studies department there. And my dissertation was about, and this became the subject of my first book, Divine Currency, but about the ways that early Christian thought and these key theologians that were sort of hammering out doctrine in the early church were influenced by and actively borrowed ideas from the Roman economy and the Roman monetization of society, basically, to express ideas about God, express ideas about salvation, and make sense of their theology.
So for those who know the scripture, and fundamentalists like myself, who recovering or transforming fundamentalist, let's talk about a couple of statements, right? This situation in which they tried to trap Jesus, right? The temple tax, and he says, whose image is on the coin, right? And then he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Does that play in at all? And a related question, is there a difference between mammon and money? And if so, what is the difference to those two things? So those are some, scriptural references at the time you're referencing of Rome occupation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, those and a number of other scriptural references are absolutely all kind of in the mix here. The render to Caesar passage is a really important and much debated passage that, again, folks have a lot of interpretations of. But yeah, there's this scenario where these two different factions who actually don't agree with each other are coming to test Jesus, and basically there's no right answer he can give. Give based on the question they posed to him. One answer will either please one and anger the other, or vice versa. And so he gives this really cryptic answer, partly to avoid the trap that they're in. And there's a lot that we can make of his answer of, asking for them to bring a coin and asking them whose image it's on it. It's Caesar's image. And he says, well, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God, right? One of the things I talk about there that I trace in my book are the ways that early Christian theologians use money, and even like the materiality of money, like holding up a coin and looking at it, to talk about, for example, how Jesus as the incarnate Son images and mirrors the Father who is invisible, in the same way that an image on a coin mirrors and references the emperor whose image it bears. So there's a lot of theological work and traction and conceptual work that they do with this idea of representation, of what does it mean for an image or something material to represent something that's spiritual, transcendent, immaterial. And so that there's a lot of traction out of that. But part of what they end up doing is using the language of coining, minting, and stamping to talk about humans being made in the image of God, for example. There's coining.
Like the title of this show.
Exactly, right? So links to the title of this show, right? The language of being made in the image of God is connected to humans being minted, in a sense, like coins of an emperor. So there's a really wild way that this language is monetized. There's a kind of monetization of the idea of a human identity and human character, for example. That's just one thing that I explore. But yeah, we can certainly, we can talk about that actual passage and the various interpretations that come out of it. And the Mammon,
not so much. I just wanted to ground what you were saying intellectually about your PhD and your book focus, into something that some in the audience could relate to from having read the Bible, as to what these key questions were. I'm just trying to. Not necessarily that you have to dive into every aspect of it. The other one that people know is, serving two masters, you will serve God or Mammon. What is Mammon? What does the word mammon mean? And is it the same as money or not? Yeah,
this is another one that's debated by scholars and interpreters. Most take it to just mean wealth or money, but there is a potential reference to some kind of deity that has that name. But it's, even if it is a kind of deity, it's still associated with wealth in some way.
The deity of materialism and wealth.
Exactly, right. So the takeaway still seems to be clear that there's a strong opposition, a strong dichotomy that Jesus sets up between God and the things of money and wealth. And so that's interesting.
One more in this mix is the verse that people misquote when they say the love of money is the root of all evil. That's not what the quote actually says. It says, money is the root of all evil. Money is the root of all evil. No, the quote is actually, a love of money is a root of all evil.
All sorts of evil. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So does that play in at all to your writings? Sort of this idea of coveting and loving, or is it more? No, let's talk about systems and structures and methods that work and methods that don't work. Where does your primary focus lie in your work?
My primary focus has been more on the systems and structures, both conceptually as well as like actual economic structures. Because a lot of writing and work has focused on like individual responses and individual attitudes, I wanted to take a different approach. But I have written on exactly what you've talked about, and in particular, a early Christian thinker, Clement of Alexandria, who was one of the first to really make a distinction between these strong calls that Jesus has to, for example, another verse that we didn't talk about is getting the camel through the eye of the needle, right? So it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than a wealthy person to get into heaven. So Clement is wrestling with that verse, and he takes some of the sentiments from the verse you named about the love of money being the root of all evil, as well as language from the parable of the sower, where there's the cares of the world that can creep up and choke out faith. And he says, well, when Jesus is talking about, the camel going through the eye of the needle, what he's really telling folks is to give up the cares and the love for money, not money itself. And he spiritualizes that teaching in a way that for the first couple hundred years of the church, arguably, like most Christians said, no, like when Jesus said this, it's straightforward. Like you can't be rich and go to heaven. But
so there's an interesting physical reality there. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's always been my understanding of this, having been on the City of David archaeological expedition as a college student and really looking at the local reality. There was a way to get into Jerusalem, and it was called the Eye of the Needle. And especially on the Sabbath, you had to enter in through that particular entrance. And a camel laden with goods you would have to strip all the goods off the camel, and the camel would have to get down on its knees and crawl through the eye of the needle. So literally there was a situation in which all the material things had to be left outside the gate, particularly on the Sabbath, to come in and commune with God. You had to leave all the material things behind. Is that factual? Because that's been my understanding, but I haven't researched it in decades.
Yeah, that's another one that is debated in terms of what did the text mean? What did Jesus mean? That is one interpretation. That it's referring literally to this actual place. The other is it's speaking metaphorically about.
Couldn't it be both?
Well, yeah, I think that's the important point. Is either way, there's still the same takeaway, which is that for this thing to pass through it needs to be stripped of all of its sort of impediments, all of the things that would block its way. But there's still a debate about
this is fascinating because we think of wealth as an enabler.
Sure.
It is an enabler of many things.
Totally.
And Jesus says it's not an enabler, it's a ball and chain.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this is what Clement will go on to say. He'll say that having wealth enables you to do great things in terms of blessing others and providing alms and sustaining the poor and sustaining the church, which is an important part here. So the church is concerned about its own finances.
Forget about that.
Totally. It needs patrons. It needs funders. And so
getting back to the temple tax, right? And whose image is on the coin when you pay it.
Yeah. So there's a tension that runs through Christianity and Christian teaching, as it does, I think, in other traditions as well, of a lot of anxiety and warning and concern about the perils of wealth, the problems, both for oneself in terms of one's own heart and one's own soul, of the kind of corruption that comes, but also the perils of injustice and exploitation and abuse socially that happen when people try to accumulate wealth, on one hand, as well as this other set of thinking about, well, money is an enabler and it's a tool, and maybe we can use it in ways that are beneficial. And it's a real tension and a real struggle throughout the history of the church. This is why you have as the church grows in social and political power and under Christendom and the Catholic Church in the West gets wealthy, you have the Franciscans, you have these various reform movements that are coming up along the way to talk about the importance of poverty, simplicity, not accumulating, to sort of have this back and forth debate. And it's been there from the beginnings in some ways. And of course, both sides are going to claim to have the better interpretation.
So in shifting towards the actual premises and arguments that I assume, sadly, not having had the time yet to read your books, but shifting into that, because I want you to unpack specifically how you address systems, structures, and how you pull in, perhaps the Torah and whatnot. There's this Baha'i quote, which sort of condenses this down in something called the hidden words. And it goes like this. It's very simple. With fire, we test the gold. and with gold we test our servants.
Mm. Nice.
Right? Condenses
Interesting.
this whole
Yeah.
discussion down into, God's view is, look, we purify and refine something as great as gold with fire. And now you have pure gold, which is awesome. And then we use that pure gold to test the servants with it, right?
Yeah.
So how, and then fast forward to when the Son of Man comes in his glory, Matthew 25, he will judge the nations. And you go through how he will judge. And it's all these things about how we might use the wealth, the creation of wealth on a national level, because he says he's going to test the nations. This is about the nations, not the individuals. Obviously, we can take it individually, but how are the nations performing? What structures and systems are the people who have evolved and matured to the point of self-governance and creating societies that they elect, that are not formed by Caesar or dictators? And of course, there's the debate about that, which I don't want to get into. But we elect leaders, and they represent us. They are in our image because we elect them. What does the society look like? What are the systems and structures do they deliver on all those things that Jesus castigated the people of his day for not delivering? You follow me? And are people who are thirsty getting water? Are people who are hungry getting food? Are people who are naked being clothed? Are prison systems working, and are we involved in them to make sure that we're actually helping people versus hurting people? And what about sick people? Are we helping them get well and making sure that they're all these questions that are listed in there? It's almost straight out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a whole nother Oprah. Don't want to get into today. But what are the systems and structures? So to me, that's what I imagine your work to be. Unpack for us how you view all this.
Yeah. So in terms of my work, it's primarily focused on the theological structures and systems that the church created, and how those things either challenge or reinforce the power of money, the power of economy. Because as I said, you can find evidence and arguments on both sides. So it's simplistic to say that the church has always been pretty clearly against wealth accumulation and money, or that it's only corrupt and it's only about gaining wealth and abusing wealth for power.
Well,
I think
depending on the church.
Yeah.
Depending on the church, you could say it's against its membership accumulating wealth in favor of itself accumulating wealth.
Sure. I mean, that's another critique, right? Again, depending on the church, depending on the context. And so I was interested in how is it that a tradition that seems to be really critical of money and wealth could it contribute to various societies? And I focus primarily on the West, broadly speaking, so countries that emerged in Europe and the U.S. eventually, where capitalism emerges, where the pursuit of wealth and the market economy become sort of centerpieces and really like some of the most important aspects of social life. And we can find ways that the church has supported that development over the centuries. And how do we reconcile that with these teachings that you've already invoked, when often those things seem to feel in tension? And I wanted to talk about how these Christian ideas of God redeeming, saving, paying the price for humanity's sin, this kind of economic language that's there at the heart of Christian teachings, give a kind of sacred value and sacred aura to economics and money as it's developing in these various countries. So what I did was less let's go back to the Torah and provide a systematic template, although we can certainly talk about that, and some of my other work has engaged in that, so it's totally a part of this conversation. But just to clarify, at least in terms of my initial project, was less like, let's do this kind of summary, partly because there's a lot of those out there too. It's actually a really crowded field. Everyone's got their next book about the biblical principles of wealth, or the biblical, here's like what the Bible says about X, Y, and Z. There's so much of that.
Yeah, a lot of that is very superficial and
sure, totally,
and fluffy and not clickbait exactly, but I'm saying intended to
just sell copies.
It's like refined sugar versus.
Sure.
Anyway, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, totally. So I wanted to, again, kind of take a different angle and talk about things that have been less covered, I think,
Well, I'm very interested in this idea. It had never occurred to me to view in such a transactional way Jesus' sacrifice. I've heard that criticism actually, which I just didn't even. I was like, that's ridiculous. But I guess there's some substance to people who say, well, it has that element.
Yeah. I mean, the
or
word
could be perceived as having that element.
totally. Yeah, I mean, the word redemption, which is, becomes synonymous with salvation. Redemption is an economic term, to be purchased back, to be bought back. And for the first few hundred years of the church, the major theologies of salvation, what we call soteriology, were what's known as ransom theory, that humans have been ransomed, and their debt was to the devil, and Jesus paid that price.
Let's take a step back and let's take multiple step backs and talk about revelation and language, right? So God, this is my theory, God has limited himself quite obviously with 2 seconds of common sense thought to communicating with his creation in ways that his creation can understand. God reveals himself to be beyond our comprehension, and yet we're told to know him and worship him, right? So God must reveal himself in concepts and language that we understand. And Jesus spoke in parables both to hide the meaning and make it accessible to those who had ears to hear and eyes to see, right? Because the ideas are complex, they're beyond our comprehension. A being that exists outside of time and space is communicating with people who are inside a time and space construct, for whom time is a gift that allows us to grow, like a seed being planted in the spring and bearing fruit in the summer. Quite obviously then, language around economic transactions might have been used to assist, 2-year-olds understand difficult complex concepts in simple language, but that doesn't mean that it's crass or material in its essence.
Sure, I hear what you're saying, and yes, I mean, this is I think a foundational sort of point in most theology, and theologians would want to recognize this kind of, and John Calvin famously speaks about God, accommodating to human limits. When God speaks, God lisps, as I believe Calvin put it, or at least an interpreter.
I should have read that. That's cool. I've never heard that.
The challenge is that's all we have. I mean, the language is all we have, right? So all we have to work with are these limited concepts. And yes, there's this wonderful and important tradition within theology known as negative theology or apophatic theology, which is constantly trying to remind Christians that all these labels, all these words, all these concepts that you speak about God are ultimately like imperfect and need to fall away at some point. And the challenge is, then what do you do? And what do you, when language fails, what is left? And of course we have mystical theology and mystical experiences, that's part of the tradition as well. But if you ask, many Christians, well, okay, like we speak about God as Father and use the pronoun he, cool. Like let's talk about Mother and use she, and people freak out. Right. But why? Right. Like, why should they? Right. Because, this is language that's limited and not God.
God reveals himself as a mother hen as well. So there.
Well, exactly. Right. There's a variety of examples, I think, where even if people want to acknowledge exactly what you said and agree with it, they're going to be slow to relinquish these kinds of paradigms that we have, because again, either it's all we have, or we've grown accustomed to them, or they now just seem commonsensical because we've been shaped by them for centuries.
Well, and she and they are not necessarily improvements. They're just different instances of the same problem. Sure.
But they can be improvements in the sense that they break our limits of assuming that God has a penis, to put it straightforward, And so we need that kind of disruption, right? But, you can walk into any given church on any given Sunday, at least in the US, and hear a sermon or hear praise songs about Jesus paid the price. Jesus bought me back. Yep. I've been bought by the blood of the Lamb. Yep. That transactional language is deeply ingrained into Western Christianity. And at least one of my interest is, so okay, so like if people are being shaped by that kind of language and thought on a regular basis, what is that, how does that sort of spill over into the rest of their lives in terms of their own use of money, the systems that they construct and shape, and economically, monetarily? What does that condition them to thinking, what kinds of approaches are better than others, for example? That sort of language reinforces assumptions about how we might use money, etc. And most folks are not stopping on a regular basis to sort of check themselves and say, oh yeah, this language is actually just like metaphor and an analogy, and I don't want to be guilty of like theological idolatry by putting this on God. Exactly, right? It's just there, shaping cultures, shaping Christian culture, and then the societies where those churches are active are shaped by that as well.
Yeah. Well, the biggest example I've come across in this, and I'll share it with you real quick as we wrap up this segment, and then we'll have to go to a quick commercial break, is when Paul says in the book of Hebrews, hey, you haven't been weaned, you're drinking milk, you're little babies, you need to be taught again, you should be teachers, but you're still, drinking milk. Strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. I had a conversation with a theologian who when I brought this up, she's like, oh, that's not biblical. I'm like, well, it's in the Bible. And to me, maybe theologically, it's because Jesus is the second Adam and he has the right to completely overturn that paradigm of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil being evil and being the cause of a fall. It was just prematurely consumed, and people rushing headlong heedlessly like 2-year-olds with car keys. But the truth was, God always wanted us to be as the serpent implied he didn't, right? Like God. God wanted us to be like God, discerning good and evil from the very start. And it's a matter of a maturing process. So, so this whole concept, right, of theology, being a shell that has to be, like a snake skin, right, cast off over time. Let's pause there. When we come back, I want to, go into, okay, so how do you apply this going forward? Where are you going next? How are you researching your next book? And obviously, I want to have you back on the show because we're just scratching the surface of all this, getting to know you and your ideas, and it's just such rich soil. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Devin Singh.
What if someone handed you $10 million, but told you you'd only have 24 hours left to live? Would you take the money? Most people wouldn't, because what you truly want isn't money. It's time, it's peace, it's purpose. And yet, so many believers are trading their lives chasing money in a system that was never built to bless them. They tithe, they give, they work hard, but provision still feels fragile. Why? Because provision doesn't respond to effort, it responds to order. Join us for the Miracle Money Masterclass, a free live experience where you'll discover the 7 shifts believers make to unlock supernatural provision. This isn't about hustle, manifestation, or spiritualized ambition. It's about alignment. It's about consecration. It's about becoming someone God can trust with overflow without it costing your soul. If you're done with striving, if you're ready to exit Babylon's system, and if you know it's time to restore divine order in your finances and your future, click the link and register now for the Miracle Money Masterclass. This isn't just a class, it's a reordering.
All right, we're back with Devin Singh. Basically, synopsis, we're talking about how Jesus flipped the script on everything, revolutionized things. Paul himself, implying in my view that, God always intended us to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and now we're mature enough to handle it. If we are, using it with the Holy Spirit and educating ourselves through application of our senses. Going back to one of the things you said about, the words are all we have. That's true in terms of the divinely revealed word, but the creation itself is the actual textbook, right? Or the laboratory that goes along with the textbook, right? The creation itself is the laboratory that goes along with the textbook. And that's where you really, as a student, dig into what's behind the textbook. and come to a greater and more full understanding. And that's part of the human project, in my view, all along, with occasional guidance, a new chapter and a new test, right? And a new quiz, but then go back into the lab. So what does the lab of your life look like now as you're working on your next book? And what are you doing sort of on a day-to-day basis as you do that?
Yeah, no, I like that reminder, and I think of Francis of Assisi or Bonaventure. These were these theologians who really reminded the church that God speaks through creation, God speaks through nature as well, and we can read the signs around us to get to truth. And interestingly, I think are those within the Christian tradition who reject that and only want the Bible to be the source book. And so there's, I think, tension and debate there about to what extent can we understand creation as revelatory? But I am definitely persuaded by this idea that there's a broad sense of where truth comes from, and certainly for me, part of that includes social arrangements, societies, how people have constructed ways of living, how they've built community, the kinds of relationships that we've constructed basically over the tens of thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years really in terms of the human species, but tens of thousands of years that we can have some kind of access to, whether in written historical record or the archaeological record. And all of that is an important source to think with. I'm finishing a book on debt that looks at how, again, thinking about Christian theologians have used metaphors of sin as a kind of debt, guilt as a kind of debt. They've used the language of salvation being a debt repayment. We also know about these Jubilee traditions within the Hebrew scriptures of debt cancellation that I think provide an important language for thinking about being liberated from debt slavery and debt oppression.
Every 7 years, and specifically every 49, 50 years with the year of Jubilee, even returning the land to its rightful owners, inheritors throughout perpetuity.
That's right. Yeah. So important lessons there that one can certainly draw from, going back to your initial idea of this Mosaic paradigm. I think there's a lot of important lessons about land distribution, about the limits of debt, really. I mean, this is one of my takeaways having studied this, is that the Hebrew scriptures, they do make room for redemption payments and payments to creditors, and saying there's a certain amount of time that one has to pay back their loans, etc. But when either the sabbatical year comes every 7 years or the year of Jubilee every 49, 50 years, those things need to be canceled. If there's still outstanding loans, they need to be canceled. And so from my perspective, what that law is teaching is that the law of debt has its limits, and it comes a time when it's going to be overridden by something that's more important than debt or the claims of debt, and that's mercy. That's justice. And so that's one of many, I think, takeaways from reflecting on those scriptures. But in this book that I've just finished up, I am looking at how, as I put it, the church and Christian theologians have sacralized debt, sacralized these ideas of lending and credit in ways that are at odds with how the church has also condemned usury and condemned predatory lending over the centuries. There's an interesting tension there as well. So what does it mean for a tradition that has said that lending and charging interest is wrong and predatory and exploitative? What does it mean that that tradition also was where things like the mortgage was developed, and where banking and bank-based lending ideas were really formalized when we think about what was happening in medieval Catholic Italy and then eventually in other parts of Europe? The church had a role in that. The church had a profound role in these credit instruments that became part of what we now understand as capitalism and became so essential to financing, public and private financing, the emergence of the corporation and the firm, all these things that there's theologians writing about and giving their instructions about. even while supposedly all of this is sinful. And
it's interesting. It occurs to me that, God invested us with creative powers. And one of the things that we created out of nothing is money. Right?
Interesting.
It's created out of nothing, right?
Sure.
It's just a construct. Let there be money, and there was money.
Yeah. I mean, in my view, money really what it does is it tracks the credits and debts that emerge within relationships when we make promises to one another, right? And so it's a way to quantify and track that.
And in the end, and so that now I'm really getting the depth of your work and the power of your work and the value of your work. Thank you. It took me an hour for the penny to drop, pun intended, as the Germans say, right? The penny just dropped. It's all come full circle now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot there in terms of thinking about, these are really heady, abstract concepts, right? Like, what is money? How does it work, et cetera? And like you said, right, it seems like this kind of thing that emerges out of thin air. And this is also why I think it's been such an attractive thought partner for theologians and philosophers to think about, like God or the spirit or transcendent value, because these are also these kinds of they're invisible, abstract things. And money is one way that we make sense of our own kind of social value, and now it's become a thing over the centuries for trying to make sense of this abstract thing called transcendent value, and what that might mean. So
we are actually out of time. We're going to have to pick this up in a future episode if you are willing, Mr. Singh, to come back. And I'm just going to say, any last words for the audience before we wrap this up today? And we will have you back on as soon as possible.
I mean, I appreciate the conversation. This was great, and I definitely look forward to continuing it. And yeah, I mean, if your audience is interested in these subjects, they're obviously welcome to track me down. You can find my info online. I'm happy to field questions and inquiries from folks about these kinds of things.
So it's Devin Singh, DevinSingh. Is there like a .com place?
Yeah, I mean, devinsingh.com. So that's the easiest way. You can also certainly find me at my Dartmouth faculty homepage as well. So.
And because we do have to live in the world and money is important, go on Amazon and buy that book. The first
Sounds
book,
good,
which is
sure.
What's it called again?
Divine Currency. Yeah.
Divine Currency.
Yeah.
Devin, it's been an absolute pleasure. We'll have you back soon. For everybody else, stay tuned for the sneak peek. And remember, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you next week. In the studio. In the studio with me is Matthew Hedden, who is a combat veteran. Welcome to the studio, Matthew.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm really honored to be here, and honored to have my wife to be here today. My mom was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. My daddy was a deacon. And, I loved growing up where I grew up, but I never really quite fit in. I was just too hyper and just all over the dadgum place, before everybody had ADHD and our food had all this stuff in it making us crazy,
So tell us a little bit about that transition, how you ended up going into the military.
I didn't want to go to college, but being first in my class, and it's just what you do. So I went. Well, I never went to class. I ended up losing my scholarship, leaving the school, bouncing around for a little bit, and then I had a great talk with my dad one day, asking him why he served. Being from the South, man, it's my brother served, my dad served. He was talking to me about why he joined back in Vietnam and I said, that's what I want to do. Like, I'm going to go do that thing. And I enlisted 10 days before 9/11. I did roughly 2.5 to 3 years overseas. So I did a couple tours. And during those tours, without going into a lot of detail, buried a lot of people. Some that I took their life, some was having people lose their life in my arms. Some was watching my friends get their arms and legs blown off. Some was, having friends, body parts splattered all over me. And it takes a massive toll. And during all of this, it really I developed this sense of an identity, to your point, of being a monster.